So I think the main thing that I wanted to get into here for now is talking about this idea of foreign interference and free speech and how that's under threat. And we've seen free speech under threat over the last few years in Australia, in Germany, in the UK, all kinds of really egregious examples of these efforts to criminalize protest, to criminalize certain groups or certain phrases or sayings, and try to do whatever is possible to completely like compartmentalize and ensure that any kind of criticism of Israel, any kind of criticism of Israel's depraved violence or horrifying crimes gets turned into this like kind of hate speech, and just like people become discouraged from being involved in this movement. We've seen certain efforts in Canada about this. You know, I've talked often about these efforts to equate nonviolent protest with dangerous rising anti-Semitism. And there's this like converse relationship between like the more horrifying things Israel's doing in Gaza or in Lebanon or Syria or elsewhere, the more we hand wring and must discuss this trend of rising anti-Semitism, and we must discuss people's feelings of feeling unsafe and all this stuff. And the more horrifying the crimes are, the more we're talking about this idea of people feeling unsafe and different words and slogans, or looking at things like the Spider-Man Mount Sinai Hospital incident as evidence for this crime. And no one wants to link, again, no one that has these conversations, no one that talks about this stuff wants to make this link between the actions of Israel, a country, and the objectively horrifying things that they're doing versus this rising trend. They just want to think that it's like somehow disconnected, that there's no connection between these things. No one wants to talk about how it's Israel's own actions, that if you want to talk about any kind of like a rise in anti-Semitic views or this kind of climate, you have to talk about the way that Israel's actions are pouring gasoline on that and creating the exact conditions for that kind of sentiment to increase. So far in Canada, there hasn't been as much of a legal framework about this. It's all been about like moralizing in the media, moralizing with politicians, but the legal framework is starting to come into effect. There's things like Bill C-9, which is limiting people's ability to protest in front of certain religious institutions. Even though, as we've talked about endlessly, a lot of these Zionist religious institutions are directly involved in fundraising for the IDF, bringing IDF soldiers to talk to people and talk to young people especially, doing kind of like auctions about real estate in illegally occupied territories. So there's this effort to talk about like a religious persecution when really we're obscuring the very political activities of a lot of these institutions and making it impossible for people, even like there are people that go there. You know, my friend Marley Wasser, who was on the show a couple months ago, was arrested outside her childhood synagogue with this exact kind of justification. So Bill C-9 is one of the ways that this attack and assault on free speech is being codified in the actual legal system. But then I wanted to look at this as well. This is a crazy headline and a crazy story from City News Toronto. And the headline is "All Eyes on Canada. Israel seeking significant change in how Canada tackles anti-Semitism." And like, I find myself pretty stunned just at like the wording of this headline. And we've talked about it on this show and all the endless hand-wringing about foreign interference in our politics. How many stories, how many news stories, how many bullshit speeches in our parliament where we've talked about like Chinese interference. Oh, there's secret Chinese police stations. Anyone that's in the Chinese diaspora in this country that remotely pushes back on any of the insane anti-China rhetoric in our media, they must be part of some like Chinese cell that's being organized through WeChat or WhatsApp or whatever it is. Or all the kind of bullshit about Chinese interference in our electoral system, or controlling these random backbencher MP, or Russian interference or Indian interference, which pours gasoline on the racism that Indian and other South Asian people are constantly experiencing. We always want to talk about this. We get endless stories and endless hand-wringing about this. But when we get these kind of stories, when we say Israel is seeking significant changes in how Canada tackles anti-Semitism, the way that that's completely normalized is so strange. And this idea that like we would talk about China or Russia or any other country. China is seeking a significant change in how Canada deals with anti-China bias or anti-China rhetoric. No one would be like, "Oh, that's just like a normal thing." Yeah, and like it's not a comment on like whether India, for example, is good or bad, but it's just the way that we talk about the foreign interference, not just in politics or like the media, but the whole thing about Canada's housing market. Why is Canada's housing market one of the worst housing markets in the world? Why is it impossible for people to buy a home? I know. It's because of all these foreign homeowners. That must be the reason. There's all these foreigners coming here and buying up all the real estate. And that's why Joe, Bob, and Linda Lunchpail are not able to buy a McMansion anymore. That must be the reason. Because of all this foreign interference and foreign influence. And like, let's not talk about the ways that the housing market has been commodified and all, private equity that's domestically located buying up all of it. No, that's fine. But just this discrepancy between foreign interference when we talk about any other country versus when we talk about Israel, and then we can have these headlines like Israel seeking significant change in how Canada tackles anti-Semitism, and no one bats an eye. And there's plenty of people on Twitter or other places that are talking about it, but no one in our politics is going to be holding any hearings about Israeli interference in our political system or our political affairs or any of this stuff. It's just something that's completely normalized. It's something that we just completely accept as being something that's part of our politics. Israel seeking significant change how Canada tackles anti-Semitism. Like, why is that okay? Why is that okay for us to even entertain this idea? What Israel is seeking. Ambassador of Israel to Canada, Ido Moed, delivers remarks at International Holocaust Remembrance Day at the National Holocaust Memorial in Ottawa, January 27th. Israel is pursuing a sweeping diplomatic and public relations campaign to convince Canada to change the way it tackles acts of anti-Semitism. What are these acts of anti-Semitism? Yeah, is it Spider-Man waving a Palestinian flag in front of a hospital for 5 minutes during a march that's passing the hospital? Is it someone saying words and slogans that make people from Israel feel uncomfortable? From the office of Israel's president down to its ambassador in Ottawa, the message is the same. Canada must do more to curb threats against Jews. But while the country's ambassador is suggesting Ottawa should limit certain freedoms, and they even put scare quotes around freedoms. The country's ambassador is suggesting Ottawa should limit certain freedoms in order to deal with threats his government links to Iran. He hasn't said which freedoms should be limited. We have a very clear objective this year, that is to create a significant change in the way anti-Semitism is being dealt with here in Canada. Israeli Ambassador Ido Moed told a virtual forum last week. This is crazy. It is hard for a liberal person to think that we have to limit other people's freedoms so that our freedom will be protected, but that's where we are right now. And again, we've talked about this over the last couple of weeks, but I just want to reiterate that the amount of normalized racism in our discourse against Black people, Indigenous people, there's a whole like anti-Indigenous movement of people openly denying narratives about Indigenous genocide or residential schools. No, that's part of our discourse. That's part of free speech. The amount of open racism against Indigenous people, Black people, Indian and other South Asian people, Chinese people, whatever. It's just part of our it's part of our free speech. It's part of our culture. As we've talked about, Muslim Canadians and Arab Canadians have been targeted not just by mean words, not just by Spider-Man waving a flag, but by actual violence, gun violence, people being attacked with cars, people and families being targeted just for being Muslim, just for being Arab. Apparently that didn't require any of our freedoms to be limited in any way. This actual violence that there's a actual body count for, which is far more than anyone that's fear-mongering about this dangerous threat of anti-Semitism can point to, because there hasn't been any violence. Thank goodness. But there hasn't been. And we're talking about curtailing these quote-unquote freedoms to confront this dangerous threat. Carleton University political science Mira Sukharov, who researches Israeli-Palestinian relations and Jewish politics, said there are two things happening. Israel's trying both to improve protection for Jews worldwide and to generate support for the war it has launched with the US and Iran. And again, there's a correlation between Israel's actions, both the genocide in Gaza, attacking Lebanon, claiming more land for themselves, assassinating leaders around the world. There seems to be a correlation or an uptick between this dangerous and scary climate and Israel's actions. And no one wants to ever talk about how maybe if Israel stopped engaging with the world in that way, perhaps it might have some kind of effect or influence on this dangerous and scary climate that they're saying we need to curtail our freedoms to confront. Moed spoke after Israel issued a series of high-level statements following shootings at 3 Toronto area synagogues. Of course, yes, there's been multiple. There's been situations in Montreal as well. Multi-city, a coordinated multi-city assault on empty buildings at night for multiple years now, which weirdly there's no suspects for, no security camera footage, and no leads whatsoever as to who's been carrying out these attacks on empty buildings at night, which have the effect of starting this kind of a cycle of discourse every single time. Israeli President Isaac Herzog convened a call with Toronto area Jewish community leaders March 9th, a rare move by a country whose head of government, Benjamin Netanyahu, has yet to speak with Prime Minister Mark Carney and may never speak again if he is deceased. We don't know. Israel's embassy insists Netanyahu hasn't refused a call with Carney, but Moed said last October there was not much appetite from Israel to reach out to the Prime Minister due to his focus on Palestinian statehood. Canadian officials have said they've tried multiple times to arrange a call. And again, that speaks to how completely deranged some of these folks are, that they really look at someone like Mark Carney and they think that he's some kind of like Hamas sympathizing Israel hater, which is just from looking at his words and actions about this can be quite easily disproven. I do think it's really remarkable, this whole idea that Israel is seeking this change into how Canada tackles anti-Semitism. So far, and they're not saying what actual quote unquote freedoms are going to be under assault exactly. When anti-Semitism goes unchecked, violence inevitably escalates. Canadian authorities must act immediately and decisively before this dangerous trend leads to further attack. Again, there has not been violence. There's been attacks, quote unquote attacks on empty buildings at night. And you don't have to think that that's good. You don't have to support that. In fact, I don't support it. And I hope the perpetrators of these crimes of attacking these empty buildings at night are found. I hope they're found and we can understand what motives are motivating people to engage in this, again, multi-city coordinated national attack on these empty buildings. I would like very much for the perpetrators to be caught. What's very alarming and disturbing is when Canadians who are angry about Israel's actions, blame Jews individually or collectively here for what Israel's doing. That's obviously the biggest problem they face. And that's interesting. Let's read that again. What's very alarming and disturbing is when Canadians who are angry about Israel's actions, blame Jews individually or collectively here for what Israel's doing. That's obviously the biggest problem we face. A couple things wrong with that. Number one, Israel is engaging in the world in this incredibly violent way, committing genocide in Gaza, endless terrorist attacks and killings in the West Bank, imprisoning people, sexually abusing people in prisons, including children, deliberately targeting children with sniper fire, deliberately maiming children, invading other sovereign countries, bombing other sovereign countries. And Israel is doing all that specifically under this like umbrella of protection of saying we're doing this because we're Jewish and because we're supporting Jewish people and we're keeping Jewish people safe. And we have the Star of David in our flag, and it's the Jewish state. And any of this criticism, it means you hate Jewish people. And any talk of ceasefire, any talk of human rights, international law is all anti-Semitism because you hate Jewish people. And then you want to talk about people are getting this weird conflated idea about Jewish people in Israel. Why is that? Well, I don't know. I think that's a good question. Why is that? And there's the elephant in the room that has been difficult to talk about, but we need to talk about it, which is that most of these institutions do support Israel. And like we're saying, are not just these benign religious institutions that have nothing to do whatsoever with Israel, but are raising money, raising funds, bringing IDF soldiers to this country, engaging in real estate sales for illegally occupied land, or like Heather Reisman and Indigo, who was attacked as being some kind of like Jewish small business owner who's attacked for the crime of being Jewish and was not attacked. But Indigo was targeted by activists because she's involved in raising money to support a child-killing army of psychos in the IDF. That's why. And that's how it gets talked about. So it's actually incredible for Israel to engage in the world in this way, to specifically use their Jewishness as a kind of shield from all criticism, to have all of these big institutions that are deeply involved in fundraising and support for Israel and this like genocidal apartheid country. And then you want to say like, well, we can't be making this conflation between the individual or what Israel's doing when the primary factor that's leading people to come to this conclusion are Israel itself and their own activities and their own actions and their own words. Yeah, and then they're fear-mongering about like Iranian. It must be because of Iran. That's right. All these protests and all these slogans and all of that stuff. It's the only reason that's happening is because of Iran, because of Iran's sleeper cells. Moed singled out Al-Quds Day protests, which proponents say advocate for Palestinian rights and for sovereignty over Jerusalem. Jewish groups argue they're hateful events and point out they were pioneered by the Iranian regime. So a couple things there too. Jewish groups, ignoring the Jewish groups that are involved in these protests, and pioneered by the Iranian regime, something that's completely evidence-free. And all of this stuff is happening in response to an illegal war launched by Israel in Iran. And if you looked at some of those counter protests at the Al-Quds Day, it was as always, the Israeli supporters were the ones being violent and hateful, hanging effigies of people and generally being psychos. Moed described Al-Quds Day protests as hate marches. It is nothing else than an attempt to openly and massively delegitimize the state of Israel, he said. But that's the thing. We do live in a country where we're supposed to have freedom to assemble. And if people do want to organize protests that do want to openly and massively delegitimize the state of Israel, that's not a crime. That's not a crime to do that. And in any country that's engaging in the world in the way that Israel does should be protested and should be delegitimized. In December, and again, Carney, this is the big Palestinian supporter. Carney said during a Hanukkah event that Canada has a necessity to act on 2 years of rising hate. And interesting in this piece too, how much of it is like quotes from the Israeli ambassador and like, but then they'll say things like 2 years of rising hate with no quotes. And that's just something we're supposed to accept as fact. He linked that with Bill C-9. Like I was saying, there's been this effort to codify some of this stuff in the actual legal system. Like so far, it's been mostly just putting pressure on people, rhetoric. Now we're actually talking about laws being changed to ensure that stuff is actually illegal. And these laws are being pushed by a foreign country. So, and look, it's already happening. It's already happening.
That you've made some online posts to the Prime Minister of Canada. Anything to say about that?
Can you be more specific? What post? What I specifically said? Do you have a screenshot?
Yeah, you specifically said, and you made it online.
Because, I mean, he's a Zionist scumbag, and he's not my Prime Minister, so...
Okay.
But really, you're going to come to my door, and you're worried that I'm going to do something? Do I seriously look like a threat to you?
So that's why we came to talk, right? So those threats are made...
You know what? You guys should be busy taking care of actual real crime than standing here harassing me over fucking shit I say online.
I understand, but...
Okay, yeah, no. Don't be wasting tax dollars doing this bullshit.
Nicole, if such behavior continues, if there is...
What are you going to do? Put me in jail because I don't like our Prime Minister?
No, but if you made some threats that are concerning...
What kind of threats did I make? You still haven't shown me what I said.
You're talking over me, man. I'm trying to explain to you what the threats
Show me
are.
what I said.
So if those threats are continuing...
Show me what I said.
Right? You could be arrested and charged. Just want to let you know.
Communist Canada. How do you like working for that? How are you...
Lady, you're close to getting it. You're very close to getting it, and you're just not quite there. You're not quite there. She thinks it's because of Marx Carney. This is the sad state of political awareness that we're dealing with here. Again, and I support anyone that's being targeted for their speech when you call Mark Carney a Zionist piece of shit or whatever she said, to have the police come to their door, regardless of whether they're politically confused or not, as this lady obviously is.
Proud of yourself? Do you go back home and look at your family in the mirror and say, this is what you do for a living? You harass people for what they say online because I don't like our stupid Prime Minister and he's a Zionist scumbag?
can have your opinion. You cannot.
Whatever.
So you
I don't
cannot-
have to
but you
discuss
cannot-
anymore with this.
So listen, you
Excuse
can't-
me, don't
you
touch my
cannot-
door.
yeah, so
Don't
behavior
touch my door.
continues. We will put a report in. It's documented. If such behavior continues, the Toronto
Blah,
Police
blah, blah, blah,
takes it
blah. I
very
will say whatever
seriously.
the fuck I want about our Prime Minister. You
have
can't
an
stop
opinion.
my speech.
You can have
Sorry.
an opinion.
Yeah,
You cannot be
exactly.
threatened,
What
right?
you say is
Right.
threatening, I say is just words.
Okay.
Okay, have a
Okay.
nice day.
So-
Goodbye
so
now.
if you understand-
You see when like more conservative ladies are talking to police like that, they can get away with it. Others cannot get away with speaking to the police in that way. Again, I support this lady not being arrested for her online posts about Mark Carney, even if she is extremely politically confused. It would be funny if they were literal actionable threats. That would actually be funny. But I think if they are, then that's a serious thing that they come and they don't politely talk to you. You know, if that was the case, then they get a warrant and they come and they fucking bring you to the station and they talk to you there. If it's an actual actionable, they don't go and knock on your door and have a little chat about that. Yeah, you see how confused she is though. She's very close to understanding the dynamic, but then she doesn't quite get there. But I guess that's the point of talking about all this though, is that there is an effort right now to codify some of this stuff in our legal system to prevent people from protesting, prevent people from joining certain organizations, prevent people from using certain words or slogans. And as we're seeing in places like Germany and the UK and Australia, like it gets crazy very fast. They're arresting like 80-year-old grandmas in the UK for supporting Palestine Action, a group which engages in non-violent direct action. Like even if you want to say, oh, some of these groups are committing trespassing or destruction of property, to like make it illegal to hold up a sign or wear a T-shirt or something that one of these groups is insane. And there's only one group of people that we want to change our laws around to accommodate, and every other form of racism totally okay. You know, every other form of discrimination or hate speech, it's just part of our discourse. Like you go on the normalization of like extraordinarily open racism in Canada is like shocking, or it should be shocking. But now we have people knocking on the door because someone you use the word Zionist as a pejorative, right? That's where we are now with that. I just wanted to point this out, which is an interesting part of this angle as well. After the Quebec City mosque shooting, again, which was not an empty building at night, but was filled with people and 6 people were murdered. Just so we're clear about the discrepancy between like what violence we're talking about at these religious institutions. After the Quebec City mosque shooting, some Zionist groups like CIJA vehemently opposed legislation created to address and document Islamophobia. 2017, CIJA vehemently opposed Bill M103, legislation created to address and document Islamophobia, after the Quebec City mosque shooting in which 6 worshippers were killed and 5 injured. CIJA objected especially the use of the term Islamophobia. So I just want to really think about that. How after an attack on a mosque, which it was again filled with actual people and that had actual victims of this crime, there was this huge outcry over any effort whatsoever, not to even curtail people's freedoms, not to curtail people's speech, but to address and document Islamophobia. Not only was there this big outcry, but that specifically an outcry coming from these Zionist organizations like CIJA, who are now working overtime to change our actual laws to prevent criticism of Israel from being made in this country in protest form or on posts online.